Hi, I'm Kaylin. My mom said, "He's the king. You? Clean his toilet." Then my stepfather beat me with a belt because I refused to serve his grown son like a maid. I left with a broken arm, $1, and no toothbrush. They never called, never asked if I survived. They raised me like a tool, then tossed me like garbage. But what they didn't know, I was already building something they'd never touch. Before we dive in, what time are you listening to this, and where from? Drop a comment. Let's see how far this story travels. You ready? Dinner used to be the only time of day I could pretend we were a family. For 15 minutes, I could just focus on plates and cutlery, lining up silverware like soldiers, hoping that, just once, no one would raise their voice, that maybe Mom would smile, or he'd keep his belt on. That night, I set the table in silence. The smell of reheated pot roast filled the air, bland and heavy. I'd been careful, polished the forks, folded the napkins, even lit the cheap tea light candle from the dollar bin. Maybe peace came in small efforts. My stepfather, Greg, plopped into his usual spot like he owned the air. His son, Carter, 8 years old, legs swinging under the table, was already barking out commands like a prince with a plastic crown. "Juice," he said flatly, not even looking at me. I poured him a glass of apple juice, hands steady, jaw tight. Mom sat down across from me, tapping at her phone, not acknowledging a thing. Greg muttered, "He likes it with ice." I stood, went to the freezer. As I returned, Carter sighed loudly. "Too slow." I placed the glass down gently. He smirked, slurped it, and tossed his fork onto the floor. "Oops," he said. "Didn't bend. Didn't blink." I bent down to pick it up, knees aching against the linoleum. When I rose, I glanced at Mom, but her eyes were still glued to her phone. I placed the fork beside his plate and tried to sit down. I'd barely touched the chair when Mom's voice cut through the air like a slap. "He eats first, then you clean up. He's the king. You know your place." I froze, then sat anyway, just for a second. I was hungry too. Greg looked up slowly. "What did she just do?" Carter laughed. "She sat." Greg slammed his fork down. "Did I say she could sit?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came. Instead, I stood up again, my legs stiff. He stared at me with that look, the one that always came before the belt. My stomach dropped. "Juice," Carter barked again. I turned to the pitcher, but the glass was still full. "He hasn't even finished." Greg stood, his chair scraped back. "I said serve him." I swallowed. "He has arms. He can serve himself." The silence after that sentence was deep and dark. Then I saw Greg's hand move. He unbuckled his belt. The sound of leather sliding through denim loops filled the kitchen like a death rattle. I backed up. "Say it again," he said, stepping toward me. I didn't. But my silence wasn't obedience. It was anger, coiled and silent. The first hit came fast, across my upper arm. The second, across my back. I screamed. "Greg, stop!" I gasped. But Mom didn't move. Instead, she stood, walked over, and grabbed my face so hard her nails broke skin. "You feed him," she hissed, "or you get out. Worthless girl." He hit me again. Carter laughed. I stumbled backward, vision spinning. My right arm hung strangely. My shoulder pulsed in sickening waves. "Out!" Mom growled. I stared at her, at the woman who gave birth to me. She pointed to the door like I was a pest. "You heard me, out!" Greg yanked open the front door. "You want to act like you're grown? Then leave." I moved toward the hallway, barefoot, in my sleep shirt and thin pajama pants. I grabbed my wallet from the counter. It was empty. I checked my hoodie pocket. A single, wrinkled dollar bill. I glanced back. "Toothbrush?" I whispered. Mom slammed the door in my face. The deadbolt clicked into place. I flinched at the sound. It echoed louder than the belt. I stood there for a moment on the porch, dazed. The cold concrete burned my feet. The porch light flickered like it couldn't decide whether I deserved to be seen. My arm hung limp. I cradled it gently, trying not to cry. I wasn't going to give them that. Not anymore. I turned, stepped off the porch, and limped down the driveway. No bag, no shoes, no goodbye, just one broken arm and a single $1. Half a block down, I saw a streetlight. It flickered, once, twice, then held steady. I sat beneath it, my back against the pole, and stared up at the dark sky. A warm trickle slid down from my temple. I didn't wipe it. I looked at my hands, trembling, scraped, small, and said softly, "I'm still here." Not gone. Not erased. Still here. The street lamp above me buzzed once, then quieted. The light cast a pale yellow glow over the sidewalk, making the cracks in the concrete look like veins in old skin. I shifted slightly on the bench, wincing as my shoulder throbbed. I curled tighter into myself, trying to get warm, but the thin cotton of my sleep shirt wasn't built for the night air. The concrete beneath me was still radiating heat from the day, but it wasn't enough, not anymore. I'd moved half a mile from the porch they kicked me off, hoping to find, what, a place that wasn't theirs? Somewhere no one would call me worthless? A liquor store had its shutters down, neon signs off. I'd settled under its broken awning, trying not to look like a runaway or a statistic. My stomach had been growling for the last hour. I hadn't eaten since breakfast. Cold toast, half-burnt, Carter's leftover. I'd taken one bite before Mom snatched it back and gave it to him. Footsteps approached. Quick, loud. I tensed. A group of teenagers walked past, laughing too loudly. I looked down, pretending I wasn't there, but one of them noticed me anyway. "Yo, look at this lady, sleeping on a liquor store bench like she's in a movie or something." Another voice added, "You want a drink, Cinderella?" Then a splash. Something cold and sticky landed on my chest. Half a cup of flat soda. I gasped, jerking back, which sent a jolt of pain through my bad shoulder. They ran off, their laughter bouncing off the brick walls. I didn't yell, didn't cry, just wiped at the wet spot with my sleeve. It only smeared the sugar deeper into the fabric. I stood slowly and walked. Downtown Bakersfield at midnight isn't made for mercy. I passed closed shops, flickering streetlights, a boarded-up diner with faded letters still clinging to a promise of breakfast all day. I saw a church, a small brick one with peeling white trim. I limped up the steps and tried the door. Locked. I knocked once, twice. Nothing. Not even a light inside. Down the block, I spotted a gas station still open. The fluorescent lights made everything inside look sterile and unforgiving. I stepped in. The man behind the counter didn't look up. He just said, "Bathrooms are for paying customers." I have $1, I offered. He finally looked up. "That'll get you a bottle of water. Back wall." I nodded, trying to smile. He didn't smile back. I walked past aisles of snacks I couldn't afford. The water bottles were lined up in neat rows like little soldiers. I picked the smallest one and brought it to the counter. He rang it up. 89 cents. You want a bag? I shook my head. Outside, I found a restroom tucked behind the station. A cracked mirror hung above a sink stained orange at the edges. I leaned in, turning my face toward the light. My eye was starting to swell. A dark bruise had bloomed across my cheekbone. There were scratches down my neck and dried blood in my hair. My arm was beginning to stiffen. "This," I whispered to the mirror, "is what worthless looks like to them." I looked away and left. I wandered until I found another bench, this one across from a bus stop, beneath a billboard for injury lawyers. The phone number glared down like some kind of joke. I sat, Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't remember closing my eyes, but I remember the voice that woke me. "You hungry, baby?" It was soft, weathered, like the voice of someone who'd seen too much to be loud anymore. I opened my eyes. A man stood a few feet away, older, black, maybe 70, wearing a faded navy coat and carrying a brown paper bag in one hand and a rolled-up blanket in the other. I didn't answer. He didn't push, just nodded and lowered himself onto the bench beside me, slow and steady, like his knees had learned patience the hard way. He opened the bag, pulled out a sandwich, white bread, turkey maybe, wrapped in wax paper. He tore it in half, handed one piece to me. I stared at it. My stomach growled before I could say anything. "You don't gotta take it if you don't want," he said. "But I figured, ain't no harm in offering." I took it. My fingers brushed his for half a second. They were warm, rough. "Name's Elijah," he said. "Elijah Burke. Most people just call me Mr. Burke or Old Man Elijah, depending on the day." I nodded, still didn't speak. He took a bite of his half, chewed slowly. "Retired janitor. Used to mop floors at the courthouse. Served in Nam before that. Got myself a little room over at Grace Boarding House, 3 blocks east, $480 a month. Includes shared kitchen and bad coffee." I gave a small, crooked smile. It was the first in a while. He glanced at me, then looked back out toward the road. "Don't gotta tell me your story, but I'll tell you mine." And he did. How he got beaten near to death in '64 just for sitting at a whites-only lunch counter. How his baby brother disappeared in Mississippi. How his wife left him when the factory shut down. How he'd slept in alleys for 3 winters before he got on the list for the boarding house. "But you know what?" he said, finishing the last bite of his sandwich. "Life got better. Not fast, not easy, but it did. You just don't quit." I looked at the half sandwich in my hand. It tasted like cold meat and dry bread. But it was the best thing I'd had in weeks. He reached into his bag again and pulled out a small blanket. Not new. A little frayed around the edges. He placed it over my legs. "You got fire, girl," he said gently. "Even with them bruises, I can see it. Let it burn right, not wild." And just like that, the tears came. Not because I was hurt, but because someone, for once, didn't want anything from me. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, sniffled once. "My name," I whispered, voice barely a breath, "is Kaylin." Mr. Elijah smiled, eyes kind. "Well now," he said. "Now I know who to pray for tonight." Now someone knew my name, and for the first time I wanted to live. That thought stayed with me, even as the gray morning light crawled in through the windows of the shelter 2 days later. I'd been moved to a temporary room, bare mattress, metal bed frame, plastic chair, but it had a door that locked and a small shelf for my shoes. That was more than I'd had in weeks. I was sitting in the small cafeteria that morning, cradling a paper cup of weak coffee, staring at a biscuit that crumbled like chalk. A few other women sat nearby, mostly quiet. One mumbled to herself. Another tapped a spoon against her tray like a metronome. Then a girl I hadn't spoken to before slid onto the bench across from me. She couldn't have been older than 20. Bright eyes, worn hoodie, one shoelace tied in a knot. "You that girl?" she asked. No preamble. "The one with the stepdad who called the cops?" I blinked. "What?" "Don't gotta lie," she said quickly. "We all hear stuff. Staff gets calls, papers get passed around. The lady at intake said you acted out. Said you had a knife." I set the cup down too hard. Some of the coffee sloshed over the edge. "That's not what happened." She shrugged like it didn't matter, but her eyes lingered. I didn't blame her. She didn't know me. None of them did. But someone had already drawn the map of who I was, and it wasn't a kind one. Later that afternoon, a staff member named Shelley asked if I could talk in private. Her office smelled like lemon cleaner and old printer ink. She folded her hands across a thin file folder with my name on the tab. "Kaylin," she started gently, "I want to be transparent with you, okay? We received a report." I didn't speak, just nodded once. She opened the folder slowly. "It says there was an incident. Your stepfather claims you threatened him with a knife, that you've been unstable. They also mentioned some concerns about your history, emotional outbursts, trouble with school. You were flagged as possibly volatile." I let out a short breath that might have been a laugh, or maybe a warning. "I had one episode," I said evenly. "It was called self-respect. That's what they saw. Me saying no." Shelley didn't flinch. I'll give her that. But she still looked at me the way someone looks at a glass about to fall off a table. Not broken yet, but close. "They filed a secondary alert with child protection," she said, a little softer. "Even though you're 23, the report claims you might be a threat to minors in the home." That one stunned me into silence. They hadn't just kicked me out, they'd buried me under paperwork. My family had made me disappear on paper. "They said I ran away?" I finally asked. "They used the words flight risk." Shelley shifted in her seat. "They also requested that, if you return to the house, law enforcement be notified." I pressed my fingertips into my temples, trying to push back the nausea rising from my gut. "Is there a copy of the report?" She hesitated, then passed over a few printed pages from the file. My hands shook as I took them. I saw the familiar names: my stepfather, Gary, my mother, Monique, their signatures at the bottom, and in the space meant for incident description. Subject became agitated, threatening demeanor, attempted to harm family member. Nowhere did it mention my fractured shoulder, the bruises down my ribs, or the night I slept on concrete while blood dried on my face. No mention of the soda thrown at me, or the sandwich that saved me. My eyes stopped at one signature, Mom's, Monique Taylor, in cursive. She didn't even use her maiden name anymore. She'd chosen Gary's identity like a second skin, and she'd signed off on my erasure. "She wanted me to disappear," I whispered. "And now I have." I left Shelley's office in silence and wandered back to my room. I sat on the bed, report pages still in hand, reading them again under the yellow bulb above. I should have cried. Instead, I remembered something Nashira once told me in 10th grade, back when we still thought growing up meant something good. "You gotta write your own version, Kaylin, or they'll write it for you. And then you'll be stuck living someone else's story." I hadn't thought about Nashira in years, but her voice came back, crisp and steady. That night, I slipped out quietly and walked to the small public library near 8th and K Street. It was still open for another hour. I asked to use the computer lab, and the woman at the front desk handed me a scratch paper slip with a login code. I sat at the corner terminal. The chair creaked when I leaned in. The monitor flickered to life, blue login screen, then the familiar desktop. I clicked into the browser, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then I began. Not a blog. Not a letter to the editor. Just the truth. I typed, "This is how you erase a daughter." And I didn't stop. I wrote about the cold toast, the missing toothbrush, the way my stepdad called me a mouth with legs. I wrote about the bruise behind my ear that nobody saw, about how silence was the currency of that house, how I learned to fold my anger into polite nods and empty apologies. I typed until my fingers ached, until the library lights dimmed once in warning. Then I found a local survivors forum, a quiet one, hidden under layers of clicks. I didn't put my photo. I didn't give a last name. But at the bottom, I wrote, "My name is Kaylin. I didn't run away. I was thrown away." I hit post. The screen flashed, then cleared. I logged off. For a long time, I just sat there, hands still on the keyboard, breathing in the stale air and leftover heat from old machines. My heart beat like I'd run a mile. Outside, the night was quiet, warm. I walked back to the shelter, slow, steady. My story wasn't loud, but it was mine now. They erased me with stories, and I planned to write one they couldn't delete. 3 weeks later, I stood outside a narrow shop tucked between a boarded-up tax office and a laundromat with one flickering "open" sign. A painted wooden board above the door read, "Cedar Clay, no fancy lights, no catchy tagline, just that quiet name, like it had nothing to prove." The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled like wet earth and something sweetly smoky. Sunlight filtered through high windows, catching dust motes that danced above shelves of bowls, vases, mugs, each one shaped like someone had tried to make sense of the world with their bare hands. Behind the counter, Evelyn looked up. Silver hair in a twist, apron splattered with dried glaze, arms folded. Her eyes scanned me, calm but not soft. "You showed up," she said. "Elijah said you might need help," I replied, shifting awkwardly. "I can try." Evelyn didn't ask about my background, not about the bruises, not about the wrap still supporting my right forearm. Instead, she reached under the counter and pulled out a block of clay wrapped in damp muslin. "It's okay to be clumsy," she said, pressing it into my hands. "It remembers everything, but it forgives easy." That was the first kindness I could trust. The studio was quiet. No music, no chatter. Just the low hum of a space that had seen sorrow before and didn't try to fill the silence. Elijah had driven me here the week before in his beat-up Chevy and said simply, "She needs to make something that doesn't scream." At the work table, I set the clay down and sat carefully. My arm still ached, deep in the bone. When I unwrapped the brace, the skin underneath was yellowing from old bruises, and faint purple lines ran like threads beneath the surface. I hesitated. Then I pressed both hands into the clay. It gave easily, soft, cool, almost comforting. But as I tried to wedge it, my right arm tensed up, and the pain flashed white-hot. I flinched. My hand slipped. The lump rolled, then caved inward. A half-formed bowl collapsed into a deflated heap. I stared at it, breath caught in my throat. It looked like me, something once upright, now slumped and uneven. Evelyn passed behind me, pausing without looking directly. "Symmetry's overrated," she said. "Pottery's about story. Even scars have shape." I nodded slowly, but I didn't look at her. My fingers hovered over the ruined piece. I pressed them gently into the clay again. "Do you think," I said finally, "clay remembers?" Evelyn walked to the shelf and picked up a thick cup, slightly warped but glazed in a deep blue that shimmered. She set it in front of me. "No," she said, "but people do. So mold something they can't forget." Later that afternoon, while others packed up their tools, I stayed behind. Evelyn didn't say a word, just handed me a fresh slab. I sat quietly and shaped it slowly, not trying to make it smooth, not chasing perfect, just letting it exist, flawed, stubborn, lopsided. When the bowl was done, I took the tip of a wooden tool and carved 2 small words into the inside rim. "Still here." Evelyn came by with a faint smile and a nod. She picked it up and turned it gently in her hands. "I'll fire it tonight," she said. "Come by tomorrow." The next morning, I returned before sunrise. The studio smelled of cooling kilns and hot stone. Evelyn handed me the bowl, glazed in soft ash gray, still warm like it had a heartbeat. I cupped it in both hands. The carved words shimmered faintly beneath the glaze. Still here. It wasn't beautiful, but it was mine. I don't know how long I stood there holding it. Maybe minutes, maybe more. Evelyn let the moment stretch. Then she walked behind the counter and came back with something small, a card. She handed it to me. White, textured stock. My name written in block letters. Below it, in neat print, Assistant Clay Technician, Cedar Clay Studio. I looked up. "You're part of the studio now," she said. "Pays small, but you matter here." I folded the card, careful like it was made of glass, and tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket. Felt like gold. That evening, as I walked home, I passed a man yelling into a phone outside a diner, someone honking in traffic, a child crying in a stroller. The city was loud again. But inside me, something had gone still, like quiet water finding its level. My body still hurt. My past still followed. But now, I had something in my hands that didn't bruise. They beat my body, but they didn't break my hands. I didn't go home that night with just a bowl. I went home with breath I hadn't lost halfway through a conversation, with fingers that no longer trembled when touched by silence, with something made, not broken. By the time a month passed, my palms were tougher. My right wrist still twinged when I pushed too hard, but Evelyn had shown me how to work around it, how to let the clay guide me instead of fighting it. And most days, that studio on Truxton Avenue became more than a building. It became somewhere I wasn't bracing for impact. That Tuesday afternoon, the kiln had just cooled. I was in the back room, unloading shelves of bisqueware with Evelyn. The heat still radiated faintly through the bricks, comforting like the last warmth of a fading sun. We didn't talk much. We rarely did during kiln days. My hands moved carefully, cradling mugs, plates, little lopsided vases that other beginners had made, and one bowl I'd shaped with a spiral edge and a thumb-smoothed base. I reached for it when the studio door chimed. Not the usual soft jingle. This was sharp. Quick. Evelyn looked up first. Her hand paused mid-reach. I heard the voice before I saw the face. "Well, didn't expect to find you playing house with mud." My heart stumbled. Braden. He filled the doorway like a shadow you thought was long gone. Taller than I remembered. Clean-cut hair, polo shirt tucked into dark jeans. But he walked like he owned the floor, like he'd never dragged a chair across it to pin someone in. My fingers stiffened around the bowl. He scanned the room, that same amused look curling his mouth like he'd just stepped into a bad sitcom. "Kaylin," he said, "still pretending you're the wounded little artist?" He let the door shut behind him and started walking, slowly, between the shelves. His fingers brushed the rim of a teacup, tapped a vase like it might be hollow. "Didn't think you'd land somewhere this sad? No neon sign? No followers? Just dirt and middle-aged pottery teachers?" Evelyn stood beside me, her arms crossed loosely. She didn't say a word, just watched. She had that way of letting the silence lean toward you, like it was daring you to flinch. Braden circled closer. "Mom says you've been airing dirty laundry online, that you're telling your version." He chuckled. "God, Kaylin, you're really doing it, huh? Playing the victim card like it's a full-time job." I set the bowl down. Not gently. He kept going, strolling like he had nowhere else to be. "You think anybody's buying it? That anyone actually believes you?" I turned to him. He looked so sure, so bored. Like this was a game and he'd already won. That used to unravel me. Not now. "You came all the way here," I said calmly, "because you're afraid. Because for once your version isn't the only one people are hearing." Braden's smile twitched. "You think this little craft project matters?" I took a step forward. "I think you showed up uninvited to a place you don't understand. That tells me everything." He scoffed. "You're just noise, static. You'll disappear like you always do." I looked down at my hands, still dry with kiln dust. Stronger now, steadier. These hands made something. "What have you made, Braden?" I asked. "Besides bruises?" His jaw tightened. Evelyn finally moved. She walked forward and stood between us, her presence quiet but grounded like brick. "This is a studio," she said plainly. "A place for healing. You brought poison in here. Braden turned toward her with a smirk. You don't know what she's like, what she's done. I know exactly what she's doing, Evelyn replied. She's rebuilding. She turned to me. Do you want me to call someone? I looked at Braden. He wasn't smirking anymore. No, I said. Let him stay. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. I want him to see something. I moved past him, walked to my wheel, sat down, took a fresh block of clay from the wrapped stack. My fingers didn't shake as I slapped it down and began wedging. The smell of damp earth filled the room again, familiar, grounding. I centered the clay. The wheel hummed beneath my foot. I shaped it gently, my hands moving in steady rhythm. My breath matched the movement. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Braden stood off to the side, arms folded, trying not to look like he was watching. But he was. He watched every movement, watched me build something from nothing. When I shaped the lip of the bowl, I heard the floor creak. His shoes turned. Then the door opened again. This time, the chime was softer. Evelyn didn't move until it shut behind him. Then she walked over, placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. That, she said, was strength. I nodded slowly, not looking up yet. I used to think silence meant safety, I whispered. But now I know. It can mean power. She squeezed my shoulder, then let go. I finished the bowl, and for the first time in years, I didn't care who believed me. I just wanted them to remember I was still standing. They wanted me voiceless, so I started sculpting my voice into something permanent. It had been a cold morning in Bakersfield. Not bitter like the storms I'd known, but a quiet kind of cold, sneaking in through sleeves and bones, the kind that made you want to wrap yourself in something that felt like care. I found it folded on the bench when I got to the studio. A quilted throw, patchy and worn, stitched together from pieces that didn't belong anywhere else. Deep reds and faded navy cottons, old flannel shirts, torn muslin. There was a little note pinned to one corner. Imperfect, but stitched with meaning. E. I sat with it around my shoulders for a while before opening the door. The fabric was soft in a way only age could make it, and for the first time in a long time, I felt held. I wasn't sure how long I'd sat there, watching the autumn light stretch across the cement floor, when I heard a knock against the doorframe. Elijah, holding 2 paper cups. "One for you," he said, handing me the warmer one. "One for the road, if, you feel like taking one." I raised an eyebrow. "Bookstore night," he added. "Community reads, cider, fire. Someone's always reciting Mary Oliver even if no one asks them to." I gave a faint smile but shook my head. "I'm not there yet." He didn't argue, just sipped from his own cup and sat beside me on the step. "Then don't read," he said. "Just sit. Just be. We save you a seat near the fireplace. You don't even have to say hello." I looked down at the blanket around me. Something about the way he said be felt like permission I hadn't known I needed. That evening I went. The bookshop sat on the corner of 8th and Milner, wedged between a shuttered record store and a bakery that only opened for 4 hours a day. From outside, it looked like it had been forgotten by time. Inside, it glowed. Lamps with soft amber bulbs dotted corners of the room, and folding chairs, no 2 the same, were scattered in a wide half-circle around a long rug. A fireplace crackled low in the back wall. Someone had placed a basket of knit throws near the hearth with a sign that read, "Borrow warmth, return later." I took the seat Elijah had promised. 2nd row, near the middle. Not too exposed, not invisible. Someone handed me a cup of cider. Another smiled without asking my name. A young woman in her 20s stepped up first. Her voice shook as she began. She read a poem about a stroke she'd had at 17, about losing half her face for a while, about how no one knew how to talk to her after. Then came a man, maybe late 50s, reading a letter to a son he hadn't seen in over a decade. His voice cracked once, just once, when he said the words, "If you ever read this." One by one, people stood, shared something that lived too long inside them. Some laughed, some cried, none apologized. And with every voice, something inside me softened. A crack, then another, like thawed ground, loosening under the touch of spring. Near the end, the host, a short woman in overalls and mismatched earrings, cleared her throat. "Anyone else?" I felt Elijah nudge me gently. I shook my head. Then I stood. I didn't know why until I was already walking to the front. My legs moved like they'd made a decision without consulting my brain. There was no podium, just a small stool. I sat, looked down at the notebook I'd started scribbling in weeks ago, more out of muscle memory than courage. My fingers found one page, torn at the corner. I read, "It wasn't the belt that hurt most. It was the sound afterward. The silence. Like the world had agreed to forget me. Like I was trash swept into corners. Quiet, invisible, unwanted." The room didn't breathe for a moment. Then someone clapped, and another. It wasn't thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was steady and kind. I went back to my seat, cider cold now. My hands shook a little, not from fear, but from release. After the event, as chairs scraped back and people trickled toward the door, a woman approached me. Late 50s, warm eyes behind large wire-rimmed glasses. She touched my arm gently. "My stepfather," she said quietly. "He did the same. I never told anyone. I never even told myself for a long time." We sat on the windowsill, talking long past the lights being dimmed. She told me about the years she lost pretending nothing happened, about the day she found a note she'd written herself as a girl and cried until her ribs ached. I told her about the woods, the silence, and how even now I sometimes flinched at kindness. We didn't trade solutions, just stories, and that somehow felt enough. The walk back was quiet. Elijah didn't say much, which I appreciated. His pace matched mine, unhurried. Outside my door, he paused and pulled something from his coat pocket, a small black notebook, simple, worn. "Blank pages," he said, handing it to me, "but the first one has something." I flipped it open. "Write it all, even the parts that ache." I looked up at him, my voice rougher than I'd expected. "They taught me I was worthless." He didn't blink. That was never the truth. For once, I didn't argue. I just nodded. And for the first time in a very long time, I walked inside without locking the door right behind me. They tried to bury me in silence, but I was learning how to sing. And sometimes, that song came through clay. It was early morning, just a week before Christmas, and the studio smelled like cinnamon tea and damp earth. I was working on a new piece, an angel wing, cracked and crooked from an earlier mistake, now reshaped into something almost defiant. I'd been sanding the curve of its edge, letting the rhythm of my hands quiet the mess in my chest, when Evelyn's voice broke the stillness. "Kaylin," she whispered, her body frozen halfway between the sink and the shelf of glazes. "There's someone at the door." I didn't look up right away. "Is it Elijah?" I asked, brushing away dust from the base. "No," she said quietly. It's her." I turned, and there she was. My mother stood outside, barely inches from the glass. She wasn't knocking, just watching. Her coat was buttoned too tightly at the neck, and she clutched her purse like it might anchor her to the sidewalk. Her breath fogged the window, and behind it, her face looked oddly gentle, curious almost. But I remembered that face when it snarled. I remembered it over me, looming, blaming. I stood motionless for a moment. My heart didn't race. It went still, like it was listening, waiting. "She doesn't belong here," I finally said, voice low. But Evelyn was already heading for the door. "I'll send her away," she offered. "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "Let her come in. Let her say whatever script she practiced in the mirror." The bell above the door jingled softly as it opened. The winter air curled in. My mother stepped through like she had every right. "Kaylin," she began, using the tone reserved for Sunday potlucks and church pews. "Honey, we've been worried sick. You just disappeared." I didn't move from my spot near the work table. "I didn't disappear," I said evenly. "I walked out bleeding." She blinked, clearly unprepared for the line I'd drawn. "Well, Braden said you weren't well. He said you were acting unstable." That name, that man. My stomach clenched. I'd once believed that if I bled quietly enough, they might love me back. "You knew what he did," I said. "You knew, and you turned away." She exhaled sharply. "Families fight, Kaylin. Things get said." "You've always been so dramatic, always turning everything into a performance." I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was all so predictable. The gaslight, the backpedal, the mask of concern. "You called me worthless," I said, still holding the angel wing in my hand. "I was 12. I remember the way your voice didn't shake when you said it. You meant it. I still hear it in my sleep." She softened her tone, but her eyes remained flat. "That was discipline. You were never easy to raise. You were headstrong, stubborn." I looked around the studio. This space, the walls, the dust, the shelves holding every flawed attempt at beauty, it had become my sanctuary, my truth. "You don't get to rewrite it," I said. "This place isn't for ghosts who lie to themselves." She took a slow step forward. "Kaylin, I came to help." "No," I said. "You came to control, like always." Evelyn had moved beside me, quiet but present, a kind of steady warmth. Behind her, Elijah stepped into the studio, his hands still coated in clay from the back room. Others from the community had paused their work, heads turned, breath held. No one interrupted, but I felt them, witnesses, anchors, and I understood in that moment what power actually was. "I'm not your daughter by obligation," I said, my voice sharp but calm. "You made that clear when you chose him over me, when you told me I'd invited it, when you said maybe if I wasn't so difficult." Her mouth opened. "Don't," I said. "Not here." Her eyes flicked to the others. She adjusted the strap of her purse. I just came to check, to help, like I said. I heard you were hiding here." "This isn't hiding," I said. "This is healing." "There's a difference." She looked at me for a long beat. Maybe she thought silence would make me reach for her, like I used to. Maybe she thought shame would fill the gap and pull me back in. But shame doesn't stick when the truth stands next to you. "Then I'll go," she said, lifting her chin with a faint twitch of pride. "That's all the help I need," I said. She turned, walked out. And as the door swung closed behind her, I watched her reflection smear across the frosted glass, distorted, incomplete, like a chapter torn from a book mid-sentence. The room was still for a few heartbeats after, then Evelyn placed her hand gently on my arm. "You okay?" I exhaled slowly. "I think I'm ready now." I walked to the gallery window. The angel wing sculpture trembled in my hands, just slightly, as I positioned it near the front display. The figure stood tall, a broken angel, wings patched and layered with ash-colored clay, standing not with grace, but with resolve. It wasn't beautiful, but it was true. She thought she could rewrite the story, but I was already writing the final chapter. That morning, I stood on the corner of 19th and Chester, coffee cooling in my gloved hands, staring at the impossible sight before me. A line that stretched halfway down the block, curling around the side of the tiny downtown gallery. People bundled in scarves and wool coats, murmuring to each other, stamping their feet against the cold, clutching printed invitations like gold. Some held brochures, some just stared into the windows, as if drawn to something beyond the glass. Evelyn met me outside, cheeks flushed, eyes lit up like Christmas lights. "You should have seen them an hour ago. It was like folks had been waiting years to breathe." I didn't answer right away. I was still processing. 2 days ago, I'd stood toe-to-toe with the woman who birthed me, and this morning, people were showing up to see the pieces she inspired. Not out of reverence, but recognition and reckoning. Inside, the gallery had been transformed. Soft lighting fell across rows of pedestals and wall-mounted sculptures. Elijah had stayed past midnight arranging everything. Even the old radiator in the corner had been dressed in a soft drape, as if the room itself wanted to forget it had once been cold. I walked slowly past each piece, letting the familiar contours pass under my gaze. Hands frozen in grief, faces warped with shame, clay wings half-formed and shattered mid-flight. But at the center, under glass, was the one that made everyone stop breathing. The reforged wing. Its curve wasn't perfect. One tip sloped lower than the other, and the base still held faint scars from the night I dropped it. But it stood tall, jagged, darkened, defiant. The plaque beneath read, "The reforged wing, created by a survivor of domestic and maternal abuse. Anonymous. Until now." I stood behind the mic, heart thudding in my ribs like it didn't know what peace felt like yet. Then I took a breath and spoke. "My name is Kaylin Ruth Bennett." The gallery went still. For years I told myself my story wasn't worth hearing, that it was shameful, that if I just kept quiet long enough, it would all fade. But shame doesn't fade. It ferments until you crack. I paused. Let the silence do its work. I wasn't just hurt. I was ignored, blamed, told to smile, serve, disappear. Told my bruises were misunderstandings, that my rage was hysteria. But clay doesn't lie. It remembers every tremor of your hands, every fracture you try to hide. The crowd didn't move. Some looked down, some looked right at me. A few had tears in their eyes. "This isn't a revenge exhibit," I said. "It's an obituary for the silence." Applause didn't erupt. It grew, slow, unsure, then louder, real. And then I saw them, near the back wall, by the door. My mother and Braden. She wore her usual trench coat, tightly belted, her hair pinned too neatly. He stood beside her, arms crossed, scanning the room like he owned it. They expected something. Deference. Maybe dread. I didn't give it to them. They moved slowly through the crowd, and wherever they went, whispers followed. I heard someone murmur, "Is that them?" And another answer, "Unbelievable, the nerve." When they stopped near the reforged wing, my mother tilted her head. "She's always been theatrical," she said under her breath, loud enough to carry. "We raised her with structure, boundaries." This is just dramatics." Before I could respond, the woman standing next to them turned her head, elegant, older, her press badge clipped to her lapel. "She sculpted your cruelty into something people paid to see," the woman said evenly. "That's not drama. That's art born from survival." My mother's mouth twitched. Braden looked away. A man with salt and pepper hair approached with a small card tucked in his suit pocket. "Ms. Bennett, I'm from the National Foundation for Contemporary Arts. We've been following your work since it began circulating online. We'd like to discuss a curated tour." New York, Chicago, possibly London. My mother stepped forward suddenly. "That's our daughter," she announced, smiling like she'd practiced. "We're just so proud of her resilience." I turned toward him. "You should know," I said calmly. "They're not here to support me. They came hoping to claim me now that the clay's worth something." The man raised an eyebrow. "Thank you." That's all I needed to hear. A reporter leaned in with a mic. "Kaylin, if I may ask, how much of this exhibit is autobiographical?" I didn't flinch. "All of it," I said. "I was beaten for not filling a plate fast enough. I was left bleeding by someone who never lifted a hand to carry anything but his own pride, and when I spoke up, my own mother called me a liar." Gasps rippled. Cameras clicked. "But I didn't rot," I continued. "I reformed." This time the applause was thunder. I caught my mother's face in the moment the crowd surged, red, hollow-eyed. Braden touched her arm, but she shook it off. They turned, walked out without another word. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. To me, they were just silhouettes now. No longer anchors, just shadows receding. Later, long after the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed to a warm hush, I stood in the back room with a candle in my hand. I lit it quietly, placing it beside a small mound of untouched clay. Not for them, for her. For the girl who survived when no one listened. The girl who stopped asking for permission. The girl who chose fire over fear. I left the candle burning as I walked out. I wasn't rebuilding my past. I was sculpting a future they'd never touch. The shelf was nothing fancy, just a piece of reclaimed barnwood I'd found at a salvage yard off Truxtun Avenue. And I sanded it down myself, stained it with a walnut tone, and mounted it on the narrow wall between the kitchen and the window in my new apartment. It creaked slightly under weight, but it held. I arranged the 3 pieces like chapters of a book I had finally finished reading. The cracked angel wing stood in the center, its sharp edge softened by time and healing hands. On one side sat a bowl, earthy and smooth, with the words "Still Here" etched along the rim, just deep enough to catch the light when the sun hit it in the morning. On the other side, the newest piece, a phoenix. Its wings were built from twisted clay, molded around bits of brass belt buckles and copper wire. I'd pulled those scraps from the box I used to hide under my bed as a child, the one filled with things I wasn't allowed to speak about. Now they rose. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the window. Inside, it was quiet, but not empty. I moved through the apartment slowly, folding a blanket, rinsing a mug, watering the single pothos on the counter. It wasn't a big space, just a modest 1-bedroom above a law office. But it was mine. No more creaky floorboards echoing with someone else's rage. No more houseplants dying from silence. When the mailbox clanged, I didn't rush to it. I let it sit. Later, with tea in hand, I opened the small silver door and pulled out the usual, a utility bill, a handmade card from Elijah's niece, and a cream envelope. No return address. Just my full name written in neat, tight handwriting I knew too well. I stood there for a moment, just breathing. Back inside, I set the other mail on the counter and brought the letter to the window. The light was soft, like early spring fog. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled the folded sheet free. "Kaylin, I was raised hard. I raised you harder. Maybe too hard. I see that now. I don't expect anything. Call if you want." "Mom." "No. I'm sorry." No mention of the forest. The gallery. Not even my name again. Just fragments. I read it twice, then folded it gently and placed it on the windowsill next to a small rock from the creek behind our old house. And I let it sit there. Not every letter needed an answer. Some were meant to float quietly into the air and disappear, like breath on cold glass. The next afternoon, Evelyn stopped by with a thermos of chamomile and 2 honey scones. She tossed her coat on the back of my stool like she'd always lived here and slid into the chair by the window. "I saw it," she said, nodding toward the letter. "I figured you would," I replied, pouring her a cup. We sat quietly for a while, listening to the hum of the street below. She finally asked, "So, will you call her?" I looked out the window. A child was walking his dog, one hand gripping the leash, the other holding a juice box. The dog kept pulling toward a tree. The boy kept laughing. "Maybe one day," I said, "but not today." She nodded, taking a slow sip. "That's fair." I turned to her and added, "Today I'm not rebuilding bridges made of ash." She smiled softly. I stood and walked to the tiny corner shelf by my desk. A candle sat in a ceramic holder I'd made years ago. I pulled a small piece of raw clay from the bowl beside it, just enough to fit in my palm. I lit the candle, held the clay over it for a moment, then dropped it into the flame. It hissed, twisted, and turned dark as it curled into itself. "Some fires purify," I said. Later that week, the studio invited me to install one of my pieces on their main wall. I chose the phoenix. We mounted it carefully. The light hit it just right in the afternoon, casting a long shadow that reached halfway across the floor. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "By Kaylin Arden, for the girl who survived." People stopped in front of it, one by one. Some paused for a long time. One woman placed her hand over her heart. Another whispered, "That's me. That's my story too." I didn't need to explain it anymore. On a quiet Friday evening, I found myself back in my little apartment, hands deep in cool clay again. The wheels spun slowly as I shaped a new figure. A tiny girl, not kneeling, not hiding, just sitting cross-legged, eyes closed, arms folded like wings, her own. I carved a soft smile into her face. Not wide, just calm. When I finished, I signed the base with a simple K. Then I stepped outside. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of orange and rose. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and concrete. It wasn't a dramatic evening, just a good one. As I stood there on the landing, keys in one hand, phone in the other, I felt something shift, not loudly, not all at once, but fully. They had raised me like a tool, so I let them rust. But I became fireproof.